Hey, how's it going, everybody? So this morning I'm riding the Primos SuperDame, or SuperDame, however you want to say it. Now this is Primos Cycle's third offering, and it represents sort of a premium version of their original Dame, which was their first gravel bike that they released. And it's a really interesting bike. I'm inclined to call it sort of like a premium budget gravel bike. But despite its name, it's not simply an upgraded version of the original Dame. In addition to all the obvious upgrades, the frame design has actually changed quite a bit. And in this video, I'll talk about all the differences between the SuperDame and the original Dame, along with all the things that I like about the new bike, and the very few things that I think could be improved. Alright, so the new SuperDame, it's still a 4130 butted chromoly steel frame, but you now get a carbon fork with this bike and comes stock with 700C wheels, hinting at its slightly more performance-oriented vibe. Now, the obvious headlines for this bike are that you get a supercharged version of the original Dame, which means you get your carbon fork, you get your 700C wheels, and you get an L-Twoo electronic 1x drivetrain with hydraulic disc brakes. Now I'm going to talk about all those changes in just a minute and discuss whether or not I think the upgrade cost is worth it. But first I want to actually talk about the frame itself, because the SuperDame is not simply an original Dame with a bunch of new upgraded parts on it. Now I test rode a size medium in both the original and this SuperDame, and there's some considerable changes to the geometry. Most notably, it's a little bit longer than the original Dame for the same size. Now the original Dame has 425mm chainstays. SuperDame extends that by 10mm to 435mm. And then presumably, so it didn't feel like you're trailing around this long rear end, the front end of the SuperDame was also lengthened by 10mm, making the overall wheelbase for the SuperDame 20mm longer than an equivalently sized regular Dame. And then in addition to the lengthening of the wheelbase, the handling has been altered slightly as well. Both the original Dame and the SuperDame feature a 71-degree head tube angle, but the steel fork on the Dame has an offset of 45mm, whereas the new carbon fork on the SuperDame has an offset of 55mm, which makes the overall trail quite different. I think on the original Dame, the calculated trail something like 72mm, which is nice and stable, whereas on the SuperDame, the calculated trail is in the mid-60s, so a little bit more responsive in the front end. I wouldn't go as far as to call it twitchy by any means. It's just a little bit less relaxed than the original Dame. Now the carbon fork itself is a lot lighter than the steel fork that comes on the original Dame, but there's also been a ton of other changes to the bike, including the group set as well as the wheel size and the tire choice. So while I don't have a direct weight of the individual fork, I did weigh both complete bikes. So the original Dame in a size medium with no pedals was right around 27 pounds, whereas the SuperDame in the same size weighs just over 25 pounds. So in its stock form with no pedals, you're getting about a 2-pound reduction, which is actually a pretty huge reduction in weight as far as complete bikes go. But I will say that the SuperDame still weighs 25 pounds, so it's not a featherweight bike by any means, and I can definitely feel that extra weight, especially because I'm used to riding gravel bikes in that sort of 18 to 22 pound range. Now as far as the handling characteristics, those little changes in the geometry combined with the change in the wheel diameter actually has a pretty significant impact on how the ride feels. Now whereas the original Dame felt like just like an all-day cruiser, the geometry was very relaxed. You have super wide 50mm tires on a 650B diameter wheel. The SuperDame does feel a lot more lively than the original Dame, and it does kind of lend itself more to that spirited ride style, if you will. Now as far as tire clearances go, these are also going to be slightly different, again because the frame design itself has changed a little bit. The original Dame will support a 700C by 50 in the rear and a 700C by 55mm tire in the front. Whereas on the SuperDame, the front clearance has not changed. You can still run a 700 by 55mm tire up front, but the rear triangle has really been trimmed down a lot, and the stated clearance for the rear of the bike is 700C by 42mm. Now just looking at this demo unit here, these are the stock 700C by 40mm Continental Terra Trail tires. These are 40mm wide, and in the rear, you can see that there's probably 5 or 6mm on either side at the chainstays, and roughly a similar clearance at the seat stays. So I would say you can probably push this to maybe a 700C by 45mm in the rear, but I probably wouldn't go any wider than that. So yeah, the frame is actually quite different from the original Dame. That's kind of the main point I wanted to get across. A lot of things have remained the same. The things that I really liked from the original Dame that were carried over to the Super Dame are things like fully external cable routing. You've got a threaded BSA bottom bracket for ease of maintenance. You have a through axle hub mounting standard. You got 2 water bottle mounts, so you don't actually get a 3rd bottle cage on this frame, but you do have plenty of mounting opportunities for racks and fenders. The fork has your 3-pack mounts, and one of the complaints that I had on the original Dame and the Primos Mono is that the 3-pack mounts were not collinear, which means that they didn't line up perfectly in a straight line, which obviously poses some problems if you want to mount a rack or a cage that has those 3 mounting holes. The 3-pack mounts on this new carbon fork, totally in line, so they have addressed that issue on the new upgraded carbon fork. And then one other thing that I really liked about the original Dame that is also carried over to the Super Dame is that it features size-specific cranks. Now the Super Dame doesn't have as many size options currently. They probably will in the future. But in this size medium here, which is currently the smallest size that they offer, they're featuring 165mm cranks, which totally makes sense. All right, so we've talked about the changes to the frame itself, as well as the wheel size, as well as generally how the bike rides compared to the original Dame. Now I think let's focus our attention on the more obvious changes. These are sort of the highlights that you would read on the main page. The Super Dame has upgraded to electronic shifting and hydraulic braking via this L-Twoo EGR wireless group set. Now I could probably do an entire review on this group set alone, but the highlights is that it still runs a 40-tooth chainring up front, and the rear electronic derailleur shifts through a 10-speed 11 to 46 cassette. As far as functionality, once the initial setup was done, the bike has actually shifted flawlessly ever since, and it's surprisingly smooth and reliable given its budget status. You know, I've done some other comparisons with the wheel top wireless group set, and I feel like the shifting quality is just a little bit more refined on the L-Twoo stuff as opposed to the wheel top stuff. Now the brakes have also been upgraded to hydraulic disc brakes. This is actually a pretty substantial difference because the original Dame features the microshift sword group, which does feature compressionless housing on its mechanical disc brakes, which work really well, but still that mechanical setup doesn't quite touch the power and modulation of even a basic hydraulic setup like this. Now the braking feel reminds me of the older generation SRAM hydraulic disc brakes. A little bit vague in terms of the braking feel, but the power and modulation is certainly there. Now I personally tend to favor Shimano disc brakes due to its more binary on-off feel, but I haven't really had any complaints about this braking setup on the L-Twoo. Super strong as far as outright power with plenty of modulation as well. So the updated group set going to electronic shifting and hydraulic braking, you've got the carbon fork and then the 700C wheels, plus the minor geometric changes to the bike frame itself, pretty much make the Super Dame a completely different bike. I'm actually a little bit surprised they called this the Super Dame because it makes it sound like this is just an upgraded version of the Dame. In my opinion, it's actually quite a different bike and quite a different experience when you're riding. I've been riding this demo unit for about 4 weeks now, and it's a really fun ride. Again, very different from the original Dame. The Super Dame feels a little bit more lively. I wouldn't call it more fun to ride. It's just, again, a different experience. The Super Dame, I would say, is just a little bit more zippy, despite the slightly longer chainstays. I think the reduction in the trail figure has a lot to do with the way that the bike handles. Is there anything I don't like about the Super Dame? Not too much, but there are a couple of things that I'll note. The handlebars that they chose to use on the Super Dame are different than on the original Dame. The angle of the drops is very much not horizontal, so they slope down a lot. So when I am in the drops, you know, it's a little bit awkward for me personally. Again, it doesn't bother me too much because I don't ride in the drops that frequently. And then something else, which is probably just unique to me, is that when I received the bike, the front brake line was super awkwardly bent in the box, and there's a noticeable kink in the front brake line here. I don't know if you can see that. You know, I haven't had a chance to replace this. It seems to be holding up for the time being, although in the back of my mind I'm kind of nervous that it might actually, you know, spring a leak or break, in which case I lose my front brake kind of instantaneously. So I've been riding a little bit careful, and at some point I'll swap that out. But I just think this was a function of how the bike was packed. But that front brake line was just super kinked, and I think it has affected the brake feel on the front brake a little bit. Again, not a huge deal, but you know, this is considered a budget bike, and so if you were to go to a shop and have them recable the front brake, you're looking at easily $50 to $75, which for a bike that starts at $1,400 is actually a pretty significant percentage of the original cost. But aside from those two very minor things, I've had no complaints with the bike at all. You know, the L-Twoo group set is really nice. The shifting quality is really good. It's surprisingly good. One thing that I did not know until I rode this group set is that it's not a completely wireless setup. This is somewhat of a hybrid between like Shimano and SRAM, in that the brake hoods and the brake feel feels like the older style SRAM road stuff. But the drivetrain itself is not fully wireless. So there's a centralized battery in the down tube, and then there's a physical wire that runs to the rear derailleur. Now this setup makes more sense to me when you're running a 2x setup. So there's just one battery that you have to charge that powers both derailleurs. In this case, I really don't see why L-Twoo hasn't just gone with the full wireless configuration. There's probably a reason. Maybe it has to do with some kind of patent thing, but Shimano started doing it, so they figured out a way. Now, I think at the end of the day, the big question is going to be, is it worth it to spend the extra money to get the SuperDame when the Dame is still a perfectly good budget gravel bike offering? Now, again, I think it's important to consider that this is not really the same bike, just an upgraded version, but they are similar in a lot of respects. And the original Dame still runs at $899 for the complete bike. What you're getting for an additional $500, because the SuperDame does cost $1,399 or $1,400 basically, for $500 extra, what you're getting is electronic shifting, hydraulic braking, carbon fork, 700C wheels, and a slightly different geometry. You're also dropping about 2 pounds off the weight of the original Dame, which is not nothing. That's a pretty substantial weight reduction. So I think the consumer really just has to consider all of these upgrades and decide for themselves whether it's worth it to shell out the additional $500. Now, in my opinion, I don't think this is the only way to go. One thing you might consider is, if you've got the money to burn, you could get the original Dame and upgrade the wheels. Now, $500 is not going to get you a super high-end carbon wheel set, but it will put you well on your way to a decent mid-range carbon wheel set, which would easily drop 1 or 2 pounds off of the bike, and so you'd be at the same weight as a stock SuperDame. And I always tend to say that if you're going to spend money on upgrades for a bike, wheels and tires are generally the first place that I would go, just because they have such a transformative effect on the ride quality and the ride feel of the bike. Who do I think the SuperDame is for? Well, I think the SuperDame is for somebody who likes modern technology, is for someone who considers hydraulic braking an absolute must, is also for someone who's looking for a slightly zippier gravel bike, something that's a little bit more nimble and lightweight. But either way, for $1,400 US in late 2025, the SuperDame is, again, just incredible value. I think the guys at Primos are doing a super job finding these little gaps in the market where they can kind of just slot themselves in as a small company and offer a really good product at a super reasonable price. Now, I've been riding this demo for about 4 weeks now. If you have any questions about my experience with the bike so far, just feel free to drop them down below in the comments. I'll do my best to answer as many as I can. That's going to do it for this one. Thanks again for watching, and thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. We'll see you next time.